Hey everyone, so with the raid on Onigashima starting, I want to get out a theory I've had for a while now, that Luffy will be fighting Jack as the first real test of his newly improved armament hockey. Now, I know that at the moment, Luffy fighting Jack is not a matchup that makes sense to most people, but it's easy to forget that at one point, it seemed like a very possible matchup. So the timeline sort of went like this. When Jack was first introduced as the villain of the Zou arc, a lot of us thought that he would eventually be fighting Luffy. Then when Jack had a bit of a setback, and we realized he wouldn't fight the Straw Hats in Zou, people started to believe that he was being saved for an eventual rematch with the Dukes. So Luffy started to seem less likely. Then when Luffy beat Katakuri, people started thinking that there would be no point at all to Luffy fighting a lowly third commander like Jack, and now recently, I think the most common matchup I've heard is Jack versus Jinbei. So, we've gone from Jack's early appearances where many thought he would be a hype matchup for Luffy, to this point where now pretty much no one thinks Luffy is going to fight Jack. And now I want to bring it back full circle to say that yes, I'm pretty sure our initial assumption was right, and we are actually going to be getting this fight. I personally never stopped believing in Luffy versus Jack, and now I feel like it's the right time to explain why. So, the simple reason I always saw Jack as a Luffy villain is that Luffy stated that one day he would defeat Jack. Now, that might seem like a silly reason, but this statement when Luffy says, I'm gonna beat this character, that is pretty much 100% success rate in the story. You can look through from East Blue through the New World over and over with dozens and dozens of villains. You can see Luffy outright saying, I'm going to beat this guy in advance, and then Luffy always does it. Oda does this because that is basically part of what Luffy's supposed to embody, a sense of absolute conviction where when Luffy decides he will defeat an opponent, he always makes that declaration a reality in the end. So yeah, throughout the series, it's generally extremely easy to know who Luffy will fight because Luffy tells us. Now, I will admit that there are two exceptions that I found over the course of the entire series. Only two, but I have to acknowledge them. One was in the first meeting with Aokiji. Now, this was before the situation got serious and Aokiji decided to fight the Straw Hats. So this was more so Luffy completely overreacting to a very chill situation. This is the one time that was very clearly written as a gag moment, and after the situation became serious, Luffy did not say he was going to beat Aokiji. He just said, I want to fight Aokiji one-on-one, but never actually claims he will win. So I don't personally count this as a real exception because the context is clearly comedic to me, but I can understand why someone would argue this is technically an exception. So I wanted to acknowledge it. But the second exception is the big one that I admit I don't have an answer for, which is Luffy telling Franky he will beat him, which never happens. This is the only time in the series that I can find where Luffy says he will beat someone where it's not treated as a gag, and Luffy then doesn't follow through. Though, I guess the twist in the end with this was that Franky ultimately turned out to be a good guy and a crewmate, which I don't think will be the case with Jack. So bottom line, does Luffy saying he intends to defeat Jack someday mean it's 100% guaranteed it will happen? No, but out of the countless times Luffy's said it in the past, it has a near 100% conversion rate, so I take this statement as an extremely likely indicator that the matchup will happen. And now there's also one big pattern that's pretty interesting which neatly fits here as well. So, we all know that usually Luffy beats the strongest, then Zoro beats second, then Sanji beats third, right? Well, there's also the last bit of the pattern that people don't really talk about, which is that Luffy also often beats the fourth strongest. So you can see this with Baroque Works where Luffy fought Mr. 3, Skypiea, Luffy fought Satori, CP9, Luffy fought Blueno, Big Mom Pirates, Luffy beat Cracker, and even with the Doflamingo organization, you could make an argument that Caesar was a more dangerous opponent than Treble and Diamante, which would make him the fourth strongest as well. So this pattern of Luffy beating the fourth strongest generally only really comes up when they are up against a big organization. So obviously, Luffy wouldn't be wasting his time with the fourth strongest on like Buggy's crew, but against big organizations with longer storylines, Oda likes to give Luffy a mini boss before the final boss, and the fourth strongest is usually a perfect fit since that doesn't take away from Zoro or Sanji's opponents, while still giving Luffy someone of decent difficulty to fight against as a warm-up. And if we look at the Beast Pirates, the order is obviously Kaido, King, Queen, and then Jack comes in at number 4. That's usually the guy that Luffy takes on as his mini-boss fight, and that is the guy that Luffy said from the start of this whole storyline that he's going to beat him along with Kaido at some point. So if we take that as a strong basic indicator to start with, that Luffy will fight Jack, does Jack seem like a Luffy villain? To me, the way Jack has been written so far strikes me as very unusual for a simple subordinate, because it's easy to forget now, but Jack had an absolutely extraordinary amount of story significance and build-up for a henchman. I mean, this was one of the first villains that Oda teased from the start of the New World, a villain that continued to be teased hundreds of chapters later, who was being hyped in advance by other characters, till finally we got this long-awaited introduction where he was revealed as the first ever billion berry bounty in this series. So, just Jack's introduction into the story was a milestone moment in One Piece. To me, that all seems like an unusual amount of spotlight and build-up for someone who is just another henchman. An easy comparison is to the other calamities, like King and Queen are stronger than Jack, but Oda dropped them on us in a fairly straightforward manner. They're strong subordinates who I could easily imagine being, Zoro and Sanji opponents at the end of the arc or something, whereas with Jack, even though he's weaker, it feels like Oda took extra care with building up his importance early on. Basically, it's hard for me to imagine Oda teasing and hyping and building up like Jinbei's opponent for literally hundreds of chapters, giving him an entire arc as the primary villain and making him the first billion berry bounty in the entire story. To me, that feels like a Luffy villain. Not a villain for the other Straw Hats or for side characters like the Dukes either. And I know people might say there's at least a story argument for the Dukes to get their revenge on Jack, but I saw this line more so as Inuarashi saying that the Minks as a whole will get their revenge on the Beast Pirates as a whole, and two things on the Dukes generally. I agree that if this was any other story besides One Piece, it would seem natural that the Dukes are going to be the ones to take down Jack as payback. But in One Piece specifically, the way it's written, just because a character has a grudge against another character does not mean they're going to ultimately get to take that character down, because Luffy exists, and Luffy's role is largely to win fights on the behalf of others. This has happened a million times over at this point. Characters have a personal grudge against a big villain, but Luffy is the one who ultimately gets the fight, essentially carrying out justice for them. Which, by the way, was exactly what Luffy wanted to do upon hearing what Jack did to the Minks. And also second, just logistically speaking, the Dukes together would likely just demolish Jack, considering they were about almost even with him on their own. So to me, this doesn't make sense as much of a fight here anyway if they're fighting together, especially if they were in Sulong form, which I imagine they would be once it's time for the major fights. Now the big objection I imagine a lot of people have is that this makes no sense because Jack is too weak. Jack is weaker than Katakuri. Jack is just the third commander. Why would Luffy fight someone weaker than his previous opponent? That's less of a challenge. Luffy should be past this, right? So first of all, Luffy barely beat Katakuri, right? Barely. For him to get another opponent of that level would be another extremely dramatic, high-intensity battle, which doesn't really make sense as a starter opponent for the Wano War. That's just not what mini-bosses are normally like, right? If Oda gives Luffy a mini-boss early in the arc, they usually present a decent challenge, but they don't leave Luffy near death. Think Satori or Blueno or Chinjao or even the Cracker fight. Right now, Jack fits pretty neatly into that category. I personally expect him to be somewhere between Katakuri and Cracker in strength, and considering how strong Luffy is right now, that would be a decent challenge, but not anything too intense. Now, the important thing is the role I expect him to play in Luffy's growth, because while he probably or obviously won't be more difficult than Katakuri, he probably will offer a very different type of challenge that is perfectly suited for Luffy right at this moment, which is testing out his advanced armament haki. Because the one thing that we know about Jack, the one really impressive feature that Oda seems to have specifically established for him, is that he's a tank. He fought against the Dukes for 5 days straight without rest. He survived taking on an admiral and former fleet admiral by himself. He survived getting hit by a literal island. As far as we've seen, it takes a lot to put him down, and that idea goes hand in hand with his fruit, which is the Mammoth Zone. So while Luffy had difficulty hitting Katakuri and had to upgrade his observation haki, Jack seems like the absolutely perfect villain that Luffy might need a little extra force in order to knock out, meaning he would be a great battle test of his armament haki. So that's all I have for this theory. I'm very interested in seeing how Act 3 plays out. If you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, share, and subscribe.